Toward the end of the year last year, we ended a study we'd made of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Those are thought to be, perhaps, Galatians is kind of questionable when it was written, but 1st and 2nd Thessalonians is sometimes called the first two letters that we have from Paul. We're going to go now into a study of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And these would be the last letters that we have from Paul. They're really not in chronological order. And we'll get into this to kind of show this as we go. It's probably 1 Timothy, Titus, and 2 Timothy. That's probably the order in which they are written. But we'll study them. I think we may just study them in that order. We'll see how that goes. But in doing that, I want to give a background before we get into 1 Timothy of what has taken place. We're going to see right in the opening verses, we're going to read about Paul and Timothy and Ephesus. And so I want to tell that story. Here it is, 1 Timothy 1 through 3. Paul, the one that writes the letter. Who's he writing it to? Verse 2. To Timothy. And notice he calls it Timothy, my own son. There are 4 times in these letters Paul writes that he refers to Timothy as his son. Now, he's not physically Timothy's father, but it's expressing that relationship that he has with him. They have a very close, tender relationship like a father would have to a son. Paul is Timothy's mentor, and he's preparing Timothy for the work that Timothy would do and training him up as he would his own son as he goes about this work. Now, I'm going to tell the story this morning of Paul and Timothy and then the city of Ephesus. And see how this story, they just entwine through these books and letters in the New Testament. One of the things I hope you gather from this, when we look and compare what we read in Acts with what we read in the epistles and then from epistle to epistle, it's just interesting to me how they all fit together. Every now and then someone comes up with the idea, well now, Luke, he didn't really write Acts. Somebody else wrote Acts a long time after this event. And Paul, he didn't really write those epistles. Someone just put Paul's name on there and they wrote it the way they thought Paul would have written it. And if you thought that different people had written these things and they weren't genuine, they weren't authentic, they weren't real, the details these things go into, there would be clash after clash after clash. They wouldn't fit together. But you can trace stories like this. Paul, and Timothy, and Ephesus, and they all fit. And that's one of the confirming things of the genuineness of these letters and of these books is how they all fit together in such a way that it would have been almost impossible for someone to pull this off as a fake. These things are genuine. So now let's look at this story. And I want to begin with Paul on his first missionary journey. That line that you see on that, the purple line, that's sort of the way he went out and came in. Not exactly, this is really his coming in, but it's about the same way that he went out. And the 3 stars there of Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra. If you remember, John Mark accompanied Paul and Barnabas to this little city called Perga, and you might see that up there near Cilicia, Perga. That's where Mark turned back. And people wonder, why didn't Mark go on? I'm kind of amazed that Mark would turn back there. But I read that if we really understood the situation, we may be more amazed that Paul and Barnabas went forward. They go from Perga up to Antioch, and it is rugged, mountainous country, and it has a bad reputation. And even after they get to Antioch and Lystra and Iconium, look at there, it's called Lycaonia. You know what the name Lycaonia means? It's wolf country. That's what that name means. And these are brutal people they're going among. Paul comes to Antioch, and due to the persecution, he is expelled from that city. He goes down to Iconium, and Jews that were after Paul, they follow him, and they convince the Jewish leaders to stone him to death. So Paul fled from Iconium, and he comes to Lystra, and in Lystra they did stone him to death and left him on the road outside of the city for dead. That's pretty rugged country, wasn't it? Brutal is what that was. Now, it doesn't mention Paul from Acts 13:49 to Acts 14:19 when it's talking about this, or it doesn't mention Timothy, but in the last letter that Paul wrote in 2 Timothy, he says in chapter 3, verses 10 and 11, "Thou hast fully known my doctrine, manner of life, purpose, faith, long-suffering, charity, patience, persecutions, afflictions which came to me at Antioch and Iconium and at Lystra. What persecutions I endured, but out of them the Lord delivered me. Yea, and all that live godly in Christ shall suffer persecution." Timothy knew about what had happened there. You see, Timothy was from Lystra, and he was acquainted with what happened at Paul during those times. Paul goes on his second missionary journey, and he returns again to Derbe and Lystra, and this is where we begin to read about Timothy. His name there, Timotheus. I hope I remember in just a minute. I'm going to tell you what that name means, Timotheus. I want to save it for just a second. But Timotheus, and he is well reported of by the brethren in that area. His mother was Jew. His father was a Greek. And Timothy had not been circumcised. And it was not necessary that he be circumcised to go to heaven. But Paul knew he's going to be working among Jews, and people knew that his father was a Greek. And it might come up, well, has he even been circumcised? And that was a stumbling stone for the Jews for expediency's sake. Paul circumcised Timothy so that would not be a stumbling block in the work that Timothy was going to do. Later we'll read about, we're going to study Titus. He would not allow Titus to be circumcised. Titus wasn't any Jew at all. He was just a Gentile, and he wanted them to know the Gentiles don't have to be circumcised. But he circumcised Timothy as an expedient so that that would not be a stumbling block. And then he wanted Timothy to go with him. Now, Timothy was a good choice. And Timothy had been trained, and he was ready for this work. Mothers and daddies, you're training your children to be ready to be servants of the Lord. And you don't know what exactly that service may be, but you're getting them ready for that. And that's what had happened with Timothy. Paul would write about his grandmother, Lois, and thy mother, Eunice, that had faith before him. And this is where I wanted to give you that name, Timothy. The name Timothy. Now, his mother named him that, and names have meanings. And in the Bible, names had, the meanings of names bore more significance than they may do to us today. The name Timothy means something like this. It's Tim and Theos. You can see that, the time and the Theos. It is either honored of God, or precious to God, or valuable to God. That's the significance of the name. Can you just say, Mama, name it? I'm going to name this child of value to God. And then train him up so he would be of that kind of value from the days of his youth. It says from a child in Timothy 3:14 and 15. From a child thou hast known the Holy Scriptures. I don't know that they didn't have Bibles available like we do, but I can just see Timothy's mother, when Timothy's just a little baby boy, said, okay, pat the Bible, pat the Bible. You know, that's what we do in our little Sunday school class. Pat the Bible. Just let them know Bible's something precious. And then teaching him little songs and little things about the law and raising that little child up. That little boy, I bet he was learning memory verses when he was just a boy. He knew the Holy Scriptures that would make him wise unto salvation from a child. So he's ready now. When Paul shows up, and Paul wants to take him on this journey, it must have been somewhat of a celebration to send him off. And we get a little insight into that. In 1 Timothy 4 in verse 14, Paul writes, neglect not the gift in thee which was given thee by prophecy with the laying on of hands of the presbytery. You remember how Paul had appointed elders in every church? That's what the presbytery is, the presbyters. Another translation for that word would be the eldership. Paul said, I'm taking Timothy, and the elders, they put their hands on Timothy. Now, that was a way of sort of appointing people to a work. And they talked about what Timothy would do. That's the prophecy we're talking about. It's not an Old Testament prophecy, but those elders are telling Timothy, you're going to be a great worker for the Lord. The Lord will use you in many wonderful ways, and you learn from Paul, and you be a good soldier. Because it says in 1 Timothy 1 in verse 18, according to the prophecies which went before on thee, that thou mightest war a good warfare. So those elders are sending Timothy off, and it's sort of somewhat of a formal send-off that they're giving him to encourage him and letting him know how valuable he is going to be. So they go from Lystra down there in the corner, and he follows Paul to Iconium, to Antioch, across Galatia, and over to Troas. And on the way, Paul wanted to go to Asia. That's where Ephesus is. Holy Spirit said, no, don't go there, not now. That'll have to come later. So Paul continues on to Troas. That's where he gets in the vision to come over into Macedonia. Paul follows him to Neapolis and then into Philippi. And you remember that's where Paul was shamefully entreated at Philippi, winding up being beaten. And Paul and Silas beaten and put in stocks in that prison. They were released from that prison, and he goes to Thessalonica. He's having great success among the Gentiles, and again the Jews raise up a persecution, and they tell Paul, you need to leave. And Paul goes down to Berea, and the Jews follow him there. And then Paul leaves Timothy and Silas behind and goes by night and makes it out of Berea and gets to Athens, where he'll be in relatively safety. But as soon as he got to Athens, he sent for Silas and Timothy, said, come join me quickly. And then Silas and Timothy come and join Paul at Athens. And Paul realizes, I need to send Timothy back to the church at Thessalonica and see how they're doing. And so Timothy goes back to Thessalonica, and Paul goes down into Corinth. And here's what we read. 1 Thessalonians 3, 1 through 2. Wherefore, when we could no longer forbear, we thought it good to be left at Athens alone, and sent Timotheus, our brother and minister of God, and our fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ, to establish you and to comfort you concerning your faith. Well, Timothy came back from Thessalonica. He came to Paul at Corinth with a good report, and it encouraged Paul. He says in 1 Thessalonians 3, 6 through 8, now when Timotheus came from you and brought unto us good tidings of your faith and charity, that ye have a good remembrance of us, always desiring greatly to see us, as we also to see you. Wherefore, brethren, we were comforted over you in our afflictions and distress in the faith. For now we live if ye stand fast in the Lord. It must have encouraged Paul in Corinth, because in Corinth he'd become unnerved. The Lord had to tell Paul, don't be afraid of their faces. I have much people in this city. And Timothy, coming down with a good report from Thessalonica, encouraged Paul. And Paul sent 2 letters back to that church. And Timothy was with him when he sent those letters. 1 Thessalonians 1 and verse 1, Paul and Silvanus, that's Silas, and Timotheus to the church at Thessalonica. 2 Timothy chapter 1 in verse 1, Paul and Silvanus and Timotheus to the church of the Thessalonians. Some think Timothy may have carried those letters back and forth. Now, I didn't see where it said that. But we know Timothy was with Paul in Corinth when he wrote those letters. And then Timothy got engaged and helped Paul with the preaching there. It says, Acts 18 in verse 5, when Silas and Timotheus were come from Macedonia, Paul was pressed in the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. And then later in writing to the church at Corinth, he made mention of that and said, for the Son of God, Jesus Christ, who is preached among you by us, even by me and Silvanus and Timotheus, was not yea and nay, but in him was yea. It wasn't some wishy-washy message. Paul and Silas and Timothy brought a very definite message that they would be able to understand. And so we have some insight now into the kind of preaching that Timothy did. He would model his preaching after the preaching of Paul. Now, from Corinth, Paul went to Ephesus. He wasn't able to stay long because he was having to get to Jerusalem. And so from Ephesus, he goes down to Jerusalem and then back up to Antioch and then begin what we call the 3rd missionary journey. He passes through Galatia again and returns to Ephesus. And that's where we pick up with Timothy again. We don't know where Timothy was during that time. But Paul mentions Timothy as one who is a minister to him while he is at Ephesus. 2 of them that ministered unto him, Timotheus and Erastus. Now that's why Paul is at Ephesus. And then Paul is going to send Timothy to Corinth. There's trouble brewing over at the church at Corinth. And just like he'd sent Timothy to Thessalonica, Timothy, I need you to go to Corinth and help that church there. Timothy crosses the sea, goes to Corinth, and then he returns. It says, he wrote in the book, if Timotheus come to receive him and conduct him forth in peace, that he may come unto me. So he goes to Corinth. He comes back with a report to Paul. He carries that letter of 1 Corinthians to Corinth. He comes back to Paul in Ephesus. And then Paul, it's about time for him to end his work at Ephesus. So he sends Timothy up to Macedonia ahead of him. It says he sent into Macedonia 2 of them that ministered to him, Timothy and Erastus. Paul intending to follow them, but then the riot broke out in Ephesus. You remember that? In the meantime, Paul had sent Titus to Corinth. And he wanted to meet Titus on his way back and find out what report he got from Titus. Paul goes up to Troas. That's where he thought he'd meet Titus. He wasn't there. Paul became very concerned. He goes up into Macedonia, and that's when Titus does show up from Corinth. And based on the report Titus gave Paul, he wrote the 2nd letter to the Corinthians. And this time, Timothy is with Paul again as he writes that letter. 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 1, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother. And so we're picking up the trail of Timothy again there in Macedonia. Now, Paul follows his letter down to Corinth and spends the winter there. That's where he writes the book of Romans that winter and sends it on to Rome. He's going to go back to Jerusalem, and he's got money with him that he's collected from all these churches for the poor in Jerusalem. And he's not going to carry that money back himself. He's going to go from Corinth to Thessalonica, to Philippi, to Troas, back near Ephesus. He'll go to Miletus and then carry that money on to Jerusalem. And he wants men going with him to help him account for these funds. And among those men that goes is Timotheus. He determines to go through Macedonia. Timothy's going with him, and he sent him on ahead to Troas. Timothy would kind of go ahead and make things ready for Paul when he would come through. Now we're going to leave Timothy again. We lose track of him while Paul goes on to Jerusalem. There Paul is arrested. He makes his appeal to Caesar. He gets on that ship that gets in a storm and gets lost at sea and is shipwrecked on an island over the winter. He finally comes to Rome. And in Rome, he writes some letters. I want you to look at these places. You see the star at Rome. That's where Paul is. He's going to write a letter to the church at Philippi, to the church at Ephesus, and that last little star out there, the name's not there, but to the church at Colossae. And Timothy is with him in Rome while he writes these letters. He's not mentioned in the first one. He's writing to Ephesus, and Ephesus is certainly part of that story. That word Ephesus is not in all the manuscripts. It's like Paul is writing the churches of Asia, sending it first to Ephesus, and from there expecting it to go to those churches. But then Timothy is mentioned in Philippians 1 and verse 2. Paul and Timotheus, servants of God, to all the saints which are at Philippi. I think that might be verse 1. But he opens the book of Philippians. Timothy's with him. He opens the book of Colossians. Timothy is with Paul while he's writing to the church at Colossae. Paul and Timotheus, our brother, to them which are at Colossae. He's writing to Philemon, who is at Colossae, and again mentions Paul and Timothy, our brother, and to Philemon. So Timothy is with Paul while he is awaiting his trial in Rome. I didn't put this one up there, and I should have. It's Philippians 2. It's about verse 19. When Paul writes to the church at Philippi, he says, my plan is to send Timothy to you. And then a few verses later, he says, and then I plan to come to you also. He says a compliment to Timothy there. He says, I have no man like-minded. Timothy being there, that's almost as good as me being there myself, because I have no man like-minded as Timothy is to me. I think that's Philippians 2. It's around verse 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, where Paul says, I'm going to follow him there as well. Now, Paul was thinking he'd be released from prison. And it appears that he was. Because there's things in 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy and Titus that don't seem to fit what we read in the book of Acts. But they would fit if Paul had been released from prison. And it sounds like Paul was released from prison and spent some time, at least he stopped by the church at Ephesus, and there was Timothy. And so he writes this letter. He leaves and goes into Macedonia. You remember earlier, Timothy had left and Paul was in Ephesus. This time Paul leaves and Timothy is in Ephesus. And shortly after he leaves is when he writes this letter. Paul unto Timothy, and said, I besought thee to abide at Ephesus when I went into Macedonia. Now, from there, it's hard to trace the journeys of Paul. Sometime he's going to spend some time in Crete. We know that from the letter he wrote to Titus. But Paul is imprisoned again. And now from a Roman prison, Paul is going to write his last letter. And he's sending it to Timothy, which we presume, we don't know exactly, but it seems to fit the best that Timothy is still at Ephesus when Paul writes this letter. Paul to Timothy, my dearly beloved son. And at the end of that letter, he tells Timothy, come see me. When you go by Troas, get the books and the parchments and get my cloak. Winter is coming. And in almost the last of Paul's writings, he says, due diligence. Come before winter. You couldn't travel through the winter. We don't even know if Paul survived that winter. This is where we lose track of Paul. It's the last that we read of him, asking Timothy to come see him in Rome. Now, we may read something else about Timothy. The book of Hebrews is somewhat mysterious into when it was written and who wrote that. But right at the end of the book of Hebrews, we read, know that our brother Timothy is set at liberty. Timothy must have been imprisoned as well. One of the scenarios that seems to fit is that Timothy did go to Rome where Paul was, and they locked him up with Paul. And now Paul's been put to death. But he has given information, perhaps to Luke, that he needs to write this letter to the Hebrews. And now Timothy has been set at liberty. And it says, they of Italy salute you. So the writer is there and says like he's familiar with Timothy's whereabouts. So it sounds like Timothy was set at liberty somewhere in Italy. And that's the last we read of Timothy. The last we read of Ephesus is in the book of Revelation. Revelation chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. And it's a good, solid, sound church, except while they had defended the truth against false doctrines, they had left their first love. It's maybe the love that they had at first. Paul's warning, Jesus is warning them, says, you return to that first love or I'll remove your candlestick. John is the one that wrote that letter that Jesus is sending to the church at Ephesus. And the tradition is that John lived at Ephesus. And it was from there that he wrote John and the three epistles. 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. And that's the last we read of Ephesus. And so we're going to get some insight into this. What's going on with Paul and Timothy in Ephesus when we read this letter of 1 Timothy. There's things in Ephesus that need to be set in order. And he's going to be telling Timothy, now look, we've got these things. They've got these doctrines to contend with. You need to talk about this going on in the public assembly. These are the kind of men you need as elders and deacons. This is the way you need to take care of the widows. And he's going to give him a lot of practical instructions that Timothy is to teach that church. And we're going to look at those instructions. And we're going to say, well, what kind of instructions then would he give Rockcliffe? Because we look to those New Testament churches as the pattern for the kind of church we ought to be. And we'll learn something about that as we go into these epistles. Well, I think those stories are fascinating. And knowing how to weave that web together, these different stories, once you start getting these strands and they start coming together, why, then the garment becomes clear and it becomes beautiful. And we know how to place the things in the New Testament in their context and seeing how it all fits together. It's just too intricately woven together to have been something done haphazardly or something done as some kind of fake. These stories that follow through all these epistles and books that tie everything together serve as a confirmation for the genuineness and authenticity of the books that we have. Faith comes by hearing such things as that. Faith comes by hearing the Word of God. And Jesus said in the Old Testament, the Scriptures cannot be broken. You can say that in the New Testament. It can be challenged, but it holds. And we can believe. We were talking in our little class this morning about whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. But how shall they call on him in whom they've not believed? Well, that shows that there's something between faith and salvation. There's believing, and there's calling, and then there's salvation. And calling is not what you say. Jesus said, not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven. He that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven. And in the parallel there in Romans 10, Paul's going to talk about, but they've not all obeyed my voice. If you believe, then you make your appeal to God for salvation. That's the call that you make to God. God, save me. But it's not what you say. It's what you do. You do the will of the Father. You obey Him. That's why Ananias told Paul, arise and be baptized and wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord. If you believe this morning, and I've just shown you reasons why you ought to believe. If you believe, you need to make that call. And you can do that while we sing this invitation song.